We're learning more about the fatal hostage situation in Sydney, Australia. More details coming to the surface show how the gunman was able to slip past the national security officials undetected. Joining us from Sydney right now is Dean Ryan. He's a WHDT producer who just happens to be there. Dean, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Gary. Good to be here.
Dean, tell us what your first impression was. Where were you when everything started to unfold in Sydney during this tragic event?
Well, Gary, luckily I was just happened to be at that Martin Place Square, where the attack happened a few days prior, and luckily I was about a few miles away from when it actually did happen. But it was extremely crowded from the holiday shopping, the gearing up by city government for New Year's Eve. It's not too far away from the Opera House, so it was just unprecedented what happened. No one saw this coming. Sydney's a peaceful city. They've never had any kind of terrorism problem or any violent act in quite some time. So it was a big surprise for all of us here in Sydney, Australia.
So how are the people in Sydney, Australians at large, viewing this specific event, since they're really not accustomed to these types of events? Right.
So Australians are really not used to any kind of violent act of any kind of nature. So from my gathering and from just what I see, Australians are shocked. To them, it's as horrific as 9/11 was to Americans. And we have to take that into consideration because things like this never happen really in Australia. It's a very peaceful country.
And what about the element of the guns? Because we know that it's virtually impossible to acquire guns in Australia. Do you have any information on how this individual acquired his weapons?
Well, you're absolutely right, Gary. Guns are very difficult to get in Australia. You actually have to belong to a gun club, and to purchase one, it takes up to a year to actually get one. So authorities currently are tight-lipped on how the assailant purchased his or received his. So that is still under investigation.
Now, Prime Minister Tony Abbott has been very outspoken against extreme Islamic violence. This gunman wasn't exactly trying to hide his extreme beliefs. He had several websites up and seemed to like the spotlight. How did security officials fail to identify this individual?
Gary, I can tell you that's a question that many are starting to bring up in just from street interviews on local news that you probably don't get back in the States. But it is true that the gunman was under surveillance, and actually we counted at least 8 appearances on news media throughout the past few years. And he was a very well-known street preacher for his beliefs in downtown Sydney. So he was under surveillance. So
tell us about
it's a little weird.
Tell us about Operation Hammerhead and the similarities to the event that unfolded.
Right. So it was unveiled the day of the terror that the police were going to start proceeding into what they called Operation Hammerhead. And basically you were going to have a Homeland Security style force combing the streets of Sydney looking for any kind of terror type people of interest. And actually I did some research on Operation Hammerhead. They started that as we know in September, so recently. So this is something they've been doing drills for quite some time for the past few months.
So would you say that the Sydney authorities were prepared for this event?
It seems like they have been prepared for it. They're doing some, in local papers, I think it was the Herald, they were busting some terror type folks in Melbourne, which is not too far from Sydney. It's about 3 hours away. So it seems like operations like these have been going on since the fall of 2014.
Now, Dean, do you expect to see any political backlash or new laws stemming from this attack, or even backlash against the Muslim community at large?
Yes, I do. I expect to see a major surveillance state coming, some legislation, and calls for more ramped up security downtown, not only for the holidays, New Year's Eve, but in the new year as well, kind of a patriot style response to it, and almost a we need to have revenge on ISIS, and it just happens to fall in line with the narrative that the U.S. is trying to paint in going to get ISIS in Syria. So it falls into the same timeline and narrative that we hear coming from the talking points of the White House.
All right, Dean, thanks for joining us from Sydney.
Thank you, Gary.
All right, that was WHDT producer Dean Ryan in Sydney, Australia. You can check out his work at 21stcenturywire.com. Up next, we've got today's special reports, and Amanda Gabriel will have your daily digital report. You're watching WHDT.